many of you are familiar with the Drake equation? The Drake equation is the equation that gives you the likelihood that we're going to encounter intelligent life in the universe. And essentially, you take very large numbers, like the number of stars that are out there, and multiply them by ever smaller things. How many planets are there? How many planets are in the right spot to support life? How many might have life? Is that life intelligent? And then you end up with kind of a smaller number. And I realize this is exactly what goes on in San Francisco, and it inspires the San Francisco housing equation, in which you take the amount of zoning and then what the building codes allow times the likelihood that the inspector will actually inspect your project before he'll go insane, the cost of materials and inflation and supply chain, unions, the NIMBY effect, the risk cost, customer demand, landmark preservation, all the way through to no fucking way. And what you end up with is less likely to build housing. Now, I know you're saying, oh, Pete, that's funny, but on some level, that's the awful truth, which is one of the reasons we're looking for exponential solutions here. So I want to wrap up by talking a little bit about how many of these technologies come together and City Science San Francisco. As Kent pointed out, San Francisco is going to join the other 10 MIT City Science labs around the world, where we get to learn what they're doing at Tolosa or in Neom or in other places. And this is actually what kind of the prototype lab looks like as it was under development in Cambridge. The idea is initially we're going to deploy a product that does complex systems modeling that will actually help people in neighborhoods understand what the neighborhood will look like, what the impact of housing will be, how it'll work. And as I mentioned before, it's really built for three constituencies: citizens, to understand what's going on, because it can be frightening when there's change, advocates who have good ideas of what to do, and policymakers like this guy who wants to know, that's our mayor, who wants to know, well, what change would make a big difference or not. Now, this is important because our population's been dropping, so the way to be economically strong and have services is to figure out perhaps how to get housing costs down and the population up. San Francisco's going through an upzoning process. Governor Newsom has said every city in the state has to come up with more housing. And if you've watched how various communities have come up with reasons not to build housing, it's one of the more creative things in America. You know, in the peninsula, maybe there's a deer, maybe there's a butterfly. In San Francisco, we actually take it seriously. So I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing. Here's a housing map. A housing map is released, and people really have no idea what it means, except, oh, it's orange. That says it's going to be 150 feet high. Will my whole street become 150 feet high? When the housing plan was released at the Planning Commission, the planning commissioners looked at it and basically said, wait a minute. Every kid has access to a video game that's very powerful, and you don't even have a 3D map or a visualization. Could you at least use AI to build us a model so you might look at what the future looks like? They kind of wrote a spec for what we're doing. And then other people said, did you even talk to people? Did you actually listen to people in doing all this? We thought we'd start with a neighborhood. So this is applying that city science process. You want to start in a neighborhood where you can actually talk to a group of people. So we've initially picked this area between District 1 and District 2 in the inner Sunset. You've got on the right Steve Sherrill's district. He's in favor of housing. On the left, Connie Chan's district. She's more against it. So this gives us commercial corridors. It gives us kind of high-density transit corridors and political differences. Okay, well, here's the map, and people really don't know what it means. If you want to understand what it means, you have to start with every parcel. Every parcel in the city has an identity. How much tax do I make? How tall can I be? What am I allowed to be used? In San Francisco, the first thing you have to realize is many of the parcels you can't touch because they're existing apartment buildings. We can't go evicting people from existing apartment buildings, so you have a lot of properties like this. So when it comes time to change San Francisco, the first thing we look at is what we can't develop. Here's another one. Have you noticed how our city has a lot of very narrow buildings, those beautiful Victorians? Well, you can't really build a 10-story building if it's not very wide. There are rules that you need a couple of stairways. So actually, unless you can buy up a lot of those little parcels, you're not going to develop them. So we kind of have to take them off the table for a while. These are some of the narrow parcels. We'll come back to them in a moment. So that leaves us with, kind of in dark green, in this neighborhood, what could actually get developed? And then the question is, what might it look like? So this is what could be developed. They're largely commercial structures, strip malls or office buildings that be converted. And then the question is, what do we do with the small businesses? Here's Clement Street. So we've used a little bit of AI, a little bit of zoning to think, what might it look like? There was a 2-story building. Under the new rules, you start with, say, pen and ink. Then we might use Midjourney or other AI tools to put in a particular design language and think about what it might look like. The tools we're building right now will be able to go through the entire city, map these buildings, play with their sizes according to the new rules, and then apply different design languages to them so we can see what might be possible. Here's another example on Geary Street. That's the O'Reilly Auto Parts place. And if you apply the new zoning to it, you see that the new bit could be this tall where you've got something commercial. You can't do a lot with that narrow building. Here's another approach. We started talking to citizens and saying, what kind of amenities do you want? Because as Kent pointed out earlier, certain amenities can be paid for as buildings get taller. So we started looking at amenities, and then we started asking, if you got taller, could you apply the design language of San Francisco to the future of San Francisco? Many people are worried, hey, if we're upzoning, it's going to look like Singapore or downtown New York, as opposed to the fact that you could make it look like San Francisco. One reason this is important is, absent this kind of work, people just have hallucinations. Here's an actual map made by a NIMBY group. They said, hey, we heard it was going to be 180 feet height in our neighborhood, so no doubt it's going to look like the world's largest Walmart. Or, getting back to space, the vehicle assembly building at Cape Canaveral. So you actually want to not have disinformation. You want to be able to use tools to show you what it'll actually look like. Now, when you do this, and you do the complex systems model, you can actually start thinking, what would that mean? So as we do all the math, you can see that in this neighborhood that has, 9,800 apartments or dwellings, if you developed every single parcel that could be developed in this neighborhood, you might get 1,700. But economic estimates tell us that in 10 years, you might only get 10% of that because of kind of all of the costs. Here's an interesting thing. You now start turning on other policy options. The point about a model is, let's play with policy options and see what works. Now, you remember how we mentioned before, you can't build tall on a narrow building because you need 2 stairs. In the United States, building code said you need 2 means of egress. But now we're beginning to experiment with narrower buildings that have 1 elevator and 1 stair because new building materials are more fire resistant. There are ways of dealing with that. Now, if San Francisco did that, you could actually then get narrower buildings that look like San Francisco. They could look like existing things. They could look like this. And when we started running the numbers on that, we found that you could get 2,700 new units if you change the building code. You could get almost double the units if you change the building code versus just planning zoning. This is one of those things that becomes very interesting to policymakers because the mayor might think I should use political capital here. Permitting reform is a big one because it just does take forever. It turns out the Turner Center that does economic analysis tells us for every 2 months you can reduce permitting time, you get about 15% more housing, which in this case would mean 500 more dwellings. So not that much. I was talking to Rachel Tanner, who leads citywide planning for the city, and she was explaining to me, this is an actual quote, San Francisco's where the world's best architects do their worst work. And I'm like, really? Why? And she started telling me. She said, well, we have sclerotic design processes. You have to design by committee. There's millions of standards. They're always changing. So architects just reverse re-engineer the regulations. It's not creative work. The guardrails stop everything. There's low risk tolerance. Is there any hope that if we relax the rules or change them, we'll get better architecture? And that is from the Planning Commission. Okay, that could lead to some completely new ideas. You remember how we said we might be able to get rid of zoning? Mickey, you should come up because you're going to tell us this. What if instead of all this permitting and stuff, you could build a building ahead of time or create it, have it pre-approved for zoning, and if you built that or something just like it, you could go ahead and do it. Show us, Mick.
Okay, this is actually pretty exciting. This is a startup called Hirshberg. And Michael Bergen and some other folks from our team doing the generative design work back at Autodesk quit Autodesk and actually started a company to do generative design for brand new community housing for basically neighborhoods. This is kind of exciting to watch. So I want you to watch how it works. You basically go in and choose what you want. It automatically figures out different things. I want a front room. I want the house width to be this. It automatically generates a parametric model that knows how to actually put in all the fixturing, all the electrical. It actually makes all the blueprints. It does the bill of materials so that you can actually do it. And this is all done by the end customer, by the homeowner who's actually exploring it. You can say, I want a Craftsman home, and it would change it to a Craftsman home. You can say, I want an Adobe home, it'll change it. You can actually encode style approaches into it, and you can be able to do that. What they're finding on job site is that it's actually reducing the cost of raw materials by 30%. Because typically, they order these houses, they build out a whole place, and it trickles down so that the next person in line basically overestimates how much wood they should be. They take the margin. The next person in line overestimates how much electrical stuff they need. It takes the margin. So it keeps going, and they end up having a huge amount of waste at the end of building something. Now, I think we've just moved on to another one. I think I must have clicked ahead. So you want to talk about urban mobility?
Let's wrap this up.
We'll wrap this up. Okay.
Right, so what you just saw is often used in new communities with single-family homes. Because a developer bought up a lot of land, those homes are pre-approved. But that concept, in fact, could come to a place like San Francisco. I would argue that the Overton window of deregulation has been opened both because of what Doge did and because we actually need to solve the problems. Ken alluded to this before. The other question that comes up is, am I going to overload my community because I'm going to have too many kids for school or use too much transit? So doing agent-based modeling, you look at stuff and you realize in this neighborhood right now it's 60% cars, 22% walking, about 10% public transportation, because many of the people there are older, they're not commuting to work, they're car-oriented. But if you put new people in the community, you'd become much more public transit-oriented. And ultimately, this takes us through to an economic analysis that shows us, hey, if you start doing these things, you create more wealth because properties turn over, more people are using transit. If you're doing family zoning, there's more kids, that's more money for schools. I think we looked at that. And that basically begins to show us how these new tools can help us have more flourishing, more housing, and perhaps new approaches. And this is what's coming to San Francisco with the City Science Lab. Sarah talked about world building, this whole idea of imagining cities. And as we do this work in San Francisco, we've tapped the World Building Lab at Gray Area, which is an art and technology center in town, to actually help us imagine and put the skills to work that are normally used to build games and fictitious worlds to build real worlds. We're working with lots of people, but more than that, I invite you to take out your cameras and sign up, because a lot of this is participatory work. We've developed technology where we have 360 cameras that can go down a street. You can take those images, turn them into models, turn those into 3D models, apply zoning so the buildings get taller or shorter, apply architecture to them, and the community can get involved in what their city can look like. We're having a hackathon coming up where we're going to enable kind of anyone to go off and be part of this whole thing. And what's exciting is there's so many emerging technologies, many that we've discussed here this week, that would not seem to be about cities. Computational law, collective intelligence, complex systems, visualization, all of which are important to our built environment. And Mickey, I think you're going to take us home with some thoughts.
I think so Peter's talking about a lot of things that are obvious, right? Yeah, we should definitely have computational law. We should do collective intelligence. Tom and Martin Reeves and Kim Polisi just talked about an amazing effort that they're doing with CrowdSmart and some other things. Yeah, we should definitely use gaming. That's pretty obvious. But I think people don't understand that we actually need everybody else who's here at this conference. And I want to explain why. It's a terminology called exaptation. How many people have ever heard of the word exaptation? Exaptation. All right, we have one person. This is kind of cool. So nature figured this out like about 3+ billion years ago in their R&D lab, and we're going to take advantage of nature's R&D lab. So if you look back to 1900, each of these bubbles is a discipline. Now, disciplines are totally artificial. The universe is not broken into disciplines. We had to do it so we could measure people, and we could train them, and we could teach them, and we could give them a career. We started that around the 1400s with Oxford and Cambridge and others. So imagine like this is Henry Ford teaching people how to do industrialized factories and things like that. This is biology, and we're like bleeding people at this point. Lancet, the book for medicine, is actually about sticking a needle into people and bleeding them. Okay, that's Lancet. Very exciting. So we got these different things. But as we're doing this, we're starting to learn the germ theory. That's exciting, and we're starting to figure out all other kinds of things. Now, if we follow these totally different disciplines that are not intersecting, they start to intersect. So imagine that right around the 1940s and 50s, we decided instead of using humans for computers, they were called computers at Bletchley Park and things like that. They tabulated numbers, mostly women. And then suddenly we said, let's have electronic computers with tubes and electronics. So this is the rise of cybernetics and the rise of computing. Pretty exciting. And most recently, we've got AI out of it. But look at that other intersection over there. Let's take a look at what really happens. If you zoom in on, let's say, biology, and you kind of follow how these emerge as separate disciplines over time, you see things start to intersect. Oh, over there, that Y over there is that machine learning and computation. For biology, the whole field actually has a set of paradigms, a set of ways they work. Their doctrine, their dogma. And that's the collection of forms and functions and theories and evidence and orthodoxies that say this is how you do medicine. And when they want to do innovation, they look in the adjacent possible. They kind of look over to the edge there in the dotted line. And then individual organizations, cultures, communities develop a field of practice to make money, to figure out things. That's like pharmaceutical companies and things like that, and doctors and stuff like that. And so they build value and culture in place, and then they look in the adjacent possible. That's where they actually harvest innovation, because that's where it is. They're like, this is the direction we're going. Let's go look for our keys we lost in the parking lot. Let's look under the light. So, but the thing is that what we've discovered over 100 years of patent filings, what we've discovered over a massive exploration of new paradigms that disrupt things, like Einstein felt really pissed off at quantum mechanics until the day he died. Disruptions in the entire dogma and the genesis of scientific revolutions is they actually don't come from the adjacent possible. They come from over there. 60% of all innovations in the 20th century, all big breakthroughs, came from over there. That's an interesting thing. So it turns out that the way they worked is through exaptation. So this is what's going on. This guy has a chocolate bar in his pocket, and he works at Raytheon. They've got giant radar dishes, and he walks by the radar dish, and the chocolate bar melts in his pocket. And he goes, oh my gosh, and that becomes the Amana radar range oven. It was not that he was trying to come up with an oven. Okay, then these guys, they're taking a clinical trial to try a brand new piece of medicine to actually help with heart disease and with blood pressure, and they start growing hair. They have hair all over their heads. This turns out to be minoxidil. The very first anesthetic was not actually developed for anesthesia. So that's what's happening is we actually co-opt, we exapt something from one form and function to another thing and actually use it 60% of the time to actually have real disruptions, to discover strategic surprise. So what is exaptation? How did nature do it? Have you ever seen one of these dinosaurs before? Anyone? Anyone? Do you know how they're different than crocodiles? Like a fundamental difference that left them around when a lot of other dinosaurs died? They're hot-blooded. So a lot of dinosaurs basically kind of get slower and slower and slower whenever it gets cold out. And these dinosaurs figured out by fractalizing some structural proteins, they could actually keep warm. And so that fractalization of proteins led to this thing called feathers. It was not for flight. It was actually, they believe now, evolutionary biologists believe that they were developed for heat. They could basically trap a lot of air in these little fractal modules. And if you ate well, you had really colorful feathers. So it was also mating rituals. You could basically be a signal, I'm healthy, mate with me. Okay, so then, some of the other dinosaurs die off. These guys are challenged, and they leap across some things, and over a long period of time, it develops into feathers. It's exapted. So exaptation happens, and it happens over here. And this is the space where we get unexpected discovery. Now think of all the different things Nicole talked about on Tuesday about the kinds of people who have been here this entire Human+Tech week. There are people thinking about spirituality. There are people thinking about mental health and mental wealth. There are people thinking about art and culture, science and design. There are all sorts of people that might be discovering something that you don't know about, or that we don't know about as a city. And so there's this huge opportunity, and I'll leave you with one little example. Imagine you're like totally into lasers, and you're developing like optical things, like you're into light bulbs and optical stuff. And then imagine somebody else is totally into vacuums. They love vacuums, they like to make vacuums, it's fun. The internet, the outer space is all filled with it. Someone else is developing computers. That's pretty cool. Oh, and then these guys, they get together and they build that. And then somebody else is working on rocket ships. And then someone else is working on amplifiers and antennas. And they're just worried about amplifying an antenna because they're building like Bell Labs and stuff like that. And then as these things come together, we suddenly get receivers, satellites, and atomic clocks. And then we get GPS. It pops out because of all this exaptation that happens. So this is the way it works. It doesn't work the way that you think it does. It's not a direct plotted line. We're doing problem finding, then we're doing function finding and form finding, and then we're doing fact finding with science, and then we're doing explanation finding to try to compress that. And then we're doing question finding, where we can ask new questions when we suddenly have these things, which turn out to be more important. Now this is kind of interesting. This is like, if you only have an egg, you can only make so much stuff. If you have butter and wheat, you can make more. If you have butter, wheat, and egg, you can make more. If you have butter, wheat, egg, and vanilla, oh my gosh, it starts to be explosive, and you get to exponential expansions, right? And the same thing is true with cultures in different parts of the world. And you can actually see, as they use ingredients, it actually starts expanding. You can see the same thing with language. You need a few words to actually have a language, and it expands very quickly. You can see the same thing with drugs. You need a few different constituent molecules that suddenly you can do a lot more. So over the course of this week, we've been talking about vital body stuff, mesh, mind stuff, performance stuff, collective intelligence, purpose, and soul. We need all of those people to help us with city science, the place we live and the place we build potential. And so I want to leave you with that and encourage you to join us.